Biological siege, the gastrointestinal defense protocol. It strikes with sudden, debilitating violence, transforming the body's internal engine into a chaotic void. Diarrhea is far more than a mere inconvenience. It is a systemic crisis, where the fluids sustaining human life are purged with terrifying efficiency. From historical dysentery outbreaks to modern viral assaults, the gut's rebellion demands immediate, calculated tactical intervention to prevent catastrophic systemic shock. We have analyzed the definitive technical strategies required to stabilize the biological architecture and restore homeostasis. The counteroffensive begins with the single most critical intervention known to modern medicine:
Oral rehydration solution. To understand the monumental significance of oral rehydration solution, or ORS, one must first comprehend the terrifying mechanics of the malady it was designed to conquer. Acute diarrheal disease, particularly in its most virulent forms like cholera, does not merely cause discomfort, it initiates a catastrophic physiological purge. The pathogen hijacks the cellular machinery of the intestinal wall, reversing the natural flow of fluids. Instead of absorbing water, the gut begins to dump the body's entire reservoir of plasma and interstitial fluid into the intestinal lumen. In severe cases, a human being can lose liters of vital fluid in a matter of hours, reducing a healthy adult to a husk of hypovolemic shock and eventual cardiovascular collapse. For centuries, the only reliable defense against this biological siege was intravenous therapy, pumping saline directly into the veins. This was effective but resource-heavy, requiring sterile equipment, trained medical personnel, and a hospital infrastructure that was often non-existent in the developing world where these diseases thrived. The discovery that a simple, precise mixture of salt, sugar, and water could replicate the effects of an IV drip is arguably the most significant medical advance of the 20th century, a low-tech miracle that has saved an estimated 50 million lives since its introduction. The science behind ORS is a masterclass in molecular biology, specifically pivoting on a mechanism known as the sodium-glucose cotransport system. Under normal conditions, the human intestine absorbs water passively. Water follows sodium. However, during a diarrheal episode caused by enterotoxins, the standard sodium absorption channels are blocked or overwhelmed. The genius of ORS lies in the discovery that there is a back door into the cell. Researchers in the mid-20th century identified a specific protein transporter, SGLT1, that remains functional even when the gut is under attack by toxins. This transporter requires a specific key to unlock: one molecule of glucose coupled with one ion of sodium. When these two components are presented in the exact right molar ratio, the transporter activates, dragging them into the cell. Once inside, the laws of osmosis take over. Water molecules rush into the cell to balance the concentration, effectively bypassing the blockade caused by the infection. It is a biological hack of the highest order, utilizing the body's own kinetic energy to reverse the flow of death. The history of this discovery is as dramatic as the science is elegant. While early experiments occurred in the 1940s and 50s, the true crucible for ORS was the volatile landscape of South Asia in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Research teams in Dhaka, then East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, and Calcutta, India, were racing against time to address cholera outbreaks that defied standard medical containment. The seminal moment, the trial by fire, occurred during the Bangladesh Liberation War of 1971. As millions of refugees poured across the border into India to escape the genocide and conflict, they settled in squalid, overcrowded camps that became breeding grounds for cholera. Dr. Dilip Mahalanobis, a pediatrician working in the refugee camps near the border, faced a nightmare scenario: thousands of dying patients and a completely depleted stock of intravenous saline. With no other option, Mahalanobis instructed his staff to mix massive batches of the oral solution in oil drums using table salt, baking soda, and commercial glucose. The results were staggering. In camps treating patients with the experimental oral fluid, the mortality rate plummeted from nearly 30% to less than 4%. It was definitive proof that this simple solution could function in the most primitive, hostile conditions imaginable. However, the implementation of ORS is not merely about mixing random amounts of sugar and salt. The precision required is akin to pharmaceutical manufacturing. If the solution contains too much sugar, it increases the osmolarity of the fluid in the gut. Instead of being absorbed, the sugary liquid draws more water out of the body's tissues into the intestine, a phenomenon known as osmotic diarrhea, which exacerbates the dehydration it was meant to cure. Conversely, too little sodium renders the solution ineffective at replacing the electrolytes lost during the purge. The World Health Organization, WHO, and UNICEF spent decades refining the formula. The original standard ORS had a slightly higher sodium content, matching the stool losses of cholera patients. However, in the early 2000s, a new reduced osmolarity ORS was introduced. This updated formula reduced the sodium and glucose concentration slightly, which clinical trials proved was even more effective for non-cholera diarrhea like rotavirus in children,
reducing the need for unscheduled IV therapy and cutting stool output. The cultural and economic impact of ORS cannot be overstated. Before its widespread adoption, a child with severe diarrhea in a rural village had a grim prognosis unless they could be transported to a hospital with IV capabilities. ORS democratized survival. It placed the power of life-saving medical intervention into the hands of mothers and caregivers. The blue sachet, a small foil packet containing the pre-measured powder costing mere cents, became a symbol of global health resilience. Governments and NGOs launched massive educational campaigns teaching the pinch and a fist method, a pinch of salt and a fistful of sugar, for homemade solutions when packets were unavailable, though this method lacked the potassium and citrate found in the commercial packets which help correct metabolic acidosis. This shift from clinical, doctor-centered treatment to home-based management fundamentally altered the epidemiology of childhood mortality. Despite its success, the battle to normalize ORS was fraught with skepticism. In the 1970s and 80s, the Western medical establishment was hesitant to abandon the gold standard of IV therapy. Many physicians viewed oral rehydration as a second-rate stopgap for poor nations, not a legitimate physiological treatment. It took years of rigorous data from the International Center for Diarrheal Disease Research, Bangladesh, ICCDRB, and advocacy by The Lancet, which famously described ORS as potentially the most important medical advance of this century, to shift the paradigm. Today, the protocol is the first-line defense in every hospital globally, from the most advanced pediatric ICUs in New York to field clinics in sub-Saharan Africa. The resistance has shifted from medical skepticism to consumer behavior. Because ORS does not immediately stop the diarrhea, it treats the dehydration, not the flow. Parents often prefer antibiotics or anti-motility drugs, which can be useless or dangerous. The challenge for the modern era remains educational, convincing the world that the priority is not stopping the symptom, but preserving the volume of the blood. Furthermore, the evolution of ORS continues. Modern research is exploring rice-based ORS, where glucose is replaced by rice power. This formulation not only rehydrates but also provides more calories and, crucially, reduces the volume of stool, addressing the main complaint of caregivers.
The complex carbohydrates in rice digest slowly, releasing glucose at the intestinal wall in a way that maximizes absorption without spiking osmolarity. This represents the synthesis of ancient dietary wisdom with modern molecular physiology. Ultimately, ORS stands as a testament to the power of reductionist science applied to humanitarian crises. It is a reminder that the most sophisticated solution to a complex biological failure is often not a new machine or a synthetic drug, but a precise understanding of the body's own equilibrium.
2. Drink plenty of fluids. While oral rehydration solution is the specialized ammunition for the crisis of severe dehydration, the broader imperative to drink plenty of fluids constructs the logistical supply line required to maintain the body's defenses during the siege of diarrheal illness. This directive, though seemingly mundane, is rooted in the complex hydrodynamics of the human body. Water is the medium in which all life-sustaining biochemical reactions occur. It is the solvent for nutrients, the coolant for thermoregulation, and the transport system for oxygen and waste. When diarrhea strikes, the body is not just losing water, it is losing the fundamental solvent of life. The advice to increase fluid intake is an attempt to balance a ledger that is rapidly plunging into the red. However, the nuance lies in what fluids are consumed, how they are consumed, and the physiological consequences of failing to maintain this delicate equilibrium. The pathology of fluid loss during diarrhea is aggressive. A healthy adult creates and reabsorbs approximately 9 liters of fluid in the digestive tract daily. This fluid comes from saliva, gastric juices, bile, and pancreatic secretions, mixed with dietary intake. In a healthy state, the small intestine and colon reabsorb 99% of this volume. During an episode of diarrhea, this reabsorption mechanism is disrupted or overwhelmed. The colon, which acts as the final desiccator of stool, fails to extract water, or worse, the small intestine actively dumps water to flush out toxins. The result is a rapid depletion of the extracellular fluid volume, the water that surrounds cells and fills blood vessels. If this volume drops too low, the blood pressure falls, the heart rate spikes, tachycardia to compensate, and the kidneys stop producing urine to hoard every remaining drop of water. This is the body entering survival mode. The strategy of drinking plenty of fluids is distinct from ORS therapy in that it applies to mild to moderate cases where the specialized glucose transport mechanism isn't strictly necessary to prevent shock, but maintenance is required to prevent deterioration. The selection of fluids is a minefield of nutritional biochemistry. The ideal fluid must be hypotonic or isotonic, meaning it has a concentration of dissolved particles lower than or equal to the blood. Water is the baseline, but water alone can be insufficient in high-volume diarrhea because it lacks electrolytes.
Drinking massive amounts of plain water without replacing sodium can lead to dilutional hyponatremia, a condition where the remaining sodium in the blood is diluted to dangerous levels, potentially causing seizures. Therefore, the medical recommendation emphasizes fluids that offer a nutritional payload: clear broths, electrolyte-enhanced waters, and diluted fruit juices. Clear soup, specifically chicken or vegetable broth, has been a cornerstone of convalescent care for millennia, and modern science validates its utility. Broth provides sodium, which is the primary electrolyte lost during diarrhea. It also contains amino acids like glycine,
protein, which can aid in gut repair and has anti-inflammatory properties. The warmth of the broth also plays a role. While not strictly a hydration factor, warm liquids can have a soothing effect on intestinal cramping, though extreme temperature should be avoided. The clear aspect is vital. Heavy cream-based soups contain fats and lactose, both of which require complex enzymatic breakdown that a compromised gut cannot handle. Fat delays gastric emptying, leading to nausea, while lactose can ferment in the colon, producing gas and worsening diarrhea. Thus, the clarity of the fluid is a visual marker of its digestibility. Conversely, the modern beverage market presents significant hazards for the unwary patient. Sports drinks, often marketed as the ultimate hydration solution, are frequently ill-suited for diarrhea treatment. While they contain electrolytes, the sugar concentration in many commercial sports drinks is far higher than the physiological ideal for an inflamed gut. This high sugar load creates an osmotic gradient that pulls water out of the bloodstream and into the intestine, fueling the watery nature of the stool, a phenomenon known as osmotic diarrhea. Furthermore, beverages high in caffeine, coffee, strong tea, energy drinks act as diuretics, stimulating the kidneys to excrete more water, which is counterproductive when the goal is retention. Alcohol is strictly contraindicated. It is a potent diuretic and a gut irritant that can strip the mucosal lining of the stomach and intestines. The behavioral aspect of hydration during illness is arguably as difficult as the biological one. Diarrhea is frequently accompanied by nausea, lethargy, and a general malaise that suppresses the thirst mechanism. Patients often feel too weak to lift a glass or too nauseous to swallow.
This leads to a dangerous cycle. Dehydration causes nausea, which prevents drinking, which worsens dehydration. The clinical approach to breaking this cycle is the sip technique. Rather than attempting to drink a full glass of water at once, which can trigger the gag reflex by distending the stomach, patients are advised to take small sips every few minutes. This slow trickle allows the stomach to absorb the fluid gradually without triggering a vomit response. In pediatric care, this often involves using a teaspoon or a syringe to administer 5 milliliters of fluid every few minutes, a tedious but life-saving labor of love. Monitoring hydration status is a critical component of the Sentry. The body provides several biological dashboards to indicate whether the drink plenty of fluids strategy is working. The most reliable indicator is urine output. A well-hydrated body produces pale, straw-colored urine every few hours. Dark amber-colored urine, or a complete cessation of urination for more than 6 to 8 hours, is a red alert signaling that the kidneys are shutting down production to preserve blood volume. Other signs include the skin turgor test, pinching the skin on the back of the hand to see if it snaps back instantly or tense, and capillary refill time, where pressing on a fingernail should result in color returning within 2 seconds. Dry mucous membranes, sticky mouth, dry eyes are early warning signs that the fluid intake is lagging behind the fluid loss. There is also a significant cultural anthropology surrounding the fluids used to treat diarrhea. In many Asian cultures, rice water, the starchy water left over after boiling rice, is the preferred remedy. Scientifically, this is sound. The starch provides a slow-release glucose source that aids absorption without the osmotic penalty of simple sugars. In the tropics, fresh coconut water is utilized for its high potassium content, though its sodium levels are often too low for severe cholera-like illness. In Western nations, the flat soda remedy, usually ginger ale or lemon-lime soda allowed to go flat, is a pervasive myth. While the carbonation removal helps reduce bloating, the sugar content remains dangerously high, and the electrolyte content is negligible. Medical professionals largely advise against this practice today, steering patients instead toward balanced electrolyte solutions or broths. The drink plenty of fluids mandate also extends to the recovery phase.
Even after the acute diarrhea stops, the body is often in a deficit. The intracellular space, the water inside the cells, takes longer to replenish than the blood volume. A patient may feel thirsty for days after the illness resolves. This is the body's way of topping off the reserves in the deep tissues. During this recovery window, continuing to prioritize hydration helps flush out metabolic waste products accumulated during the illness and restores the turgidity of cells, reducing fatigue and brain fog. Ultimately, the act of drinking fluids during diarrheal illness is a battle against gravity and entropy. The body is leaking, and the patient must pour into the vessel faster than it drains. It requires discipline, awareness, and the correct choice of liquid ammunition. It is a fundamental act of biological maintenance that separates a manageable illness from a medical emergency. By understanding the physics of osmosis, the chemistry of electrolytes, and the limitations of the inflamed gut, the simple instruction to drink fluids transforms into a calculated clinical protocol designed to sustain the hydraulic integrity of the human machine until the storm passes.
3. The brat diet: bananas, rice, applesauce, toast. In the annals of domestic medicine, few acronyms carry as much cultural weight or generational inertia as the brat diet. For decades, this 4-ingredient protocol, bananas, rice, applesauce, and toast, has stood as the undisputed gold standard for home-managed gastroenteritis, a dietary dogma passed down from pediatricians to parents and from grandmothers to grandchildren. It represents a philosophy of nutritional retreat, a strategic withdrawal from complexities of modern omnivorous eating to a fortress of bland, easily digestible carbohydrates. To understand the brat diet is to understand the history of how humanity has attempted to negotiate with an inflamed digestive tract, balancing the desperate need for calories against the body's violent rejection of sustenance. However, the story of the brat diet is not merely one of bananas and bread. It is a complex narrative of evolving medical science, the biochemistry of digestion, and a modern controversy that has seen this once sacred regimen fall from grace in the eyes of the nutritional elite. The theoretical underpinning of the brat diet rests on the concept of low-residue nutrition. When the gastrointestinal tract is under siege by viral pathogens like norovirus or bacterial invaders like salmonella, the mechanical and chemical processes of digestion are compromised. The stomach's motility is erratic, leading to nausea, while the intestines are inflamed and hypersensitive to distension. In this chaotic environment, fiber, ordinarily the hero of digestive health, becomes the enemy. Insoluble fiber found in whole grains, raw vegetables, and skins of fruits acts as a scour, stimulating the gut lining and increasing motility. In a healthy gut, this promotes regularity. In a diarrheal gut, it accelerates the transit time of stool, preventing water absorption and exacerbating dehydration. The components of the brat diet were specifically selected because they are low in fiber, chemically non-reactive, and bland enough to bypass the vomiting reflex. They are the diplomatic corps sent to negotiate with a hostile stomach. Let us dissect the first pillar, bananas. The inclusion of the banana is not arbitrary, it is a masterstroke of biochemical utility. Diarrhea and vomiting are not just water loss events, they are electrolyte stripping events. Potassium,
A vital electrolyte required for the electrical signaling of the heart and the contraction of muscles, is lost in significant quantities during loose bowel movements. Severe hypokalemia, low potassium, can lead to weakness, muscle cramps, and heart palpitations. Bananas are uniquely suited to address this deficit, providing a rich, easily absorbed source of potassium without the acidity of citrus fruits, which could irritate an inflamed stomach lining. Furthermore, bananas contain pectin, a type of soluble fiber. Unlike the insoluble fiber that scrubs the gut, soluble fiber dissolves in water to form a viscous gel. In the colon, this pectin gel acts as a specialized sponge, absorbing excess fluid and helping to bind loose stool into a more formed consistency. Additionally, green or slightly underripe bananas contain amylase-resistant starch, a prebiotic compound that passes undigested into the colon, where it feeds beneficial bacteria and produces short-chain fatty acids, like butyrate, which fuel the regeneration of the colon cells. The second pillar, rice, represents the global historical consensus on invalid cookery. Specifically, white rice is utilized because the bran and germ, the fiber and oil-rich parts of the grain, have been removed. What remains is the endosperm, a nearly pure starch bomb that is swiftly broken down by salivary and pancreatic amylase into glucose. This rapid conversion provides immediate energy to a body that is likely in a caloric deficit due to illness. Rice is also incredibly low in residue, meaning that after digestion, very little solid waste remains to pass through the colon, thereby reducing the volume and frequency of bowel movements. Culturally, this mirrors the Asian practice of serving congee or juk, a rice porridge cooked until grains disintegrate, to the sick. The starch in the rice water coats the inflamed mucous membranes of the stomach and intestines, providing a physical barrier against stomach acid and soothing the raw, irritated tissues. It is a food that asks almost nothing of the digestive system, requiring minimal enzymatic effort to process. Applesauce, the third component, offers a specific chemical advantage over raw apples. A raw apple is high in insoluble fiber, the skin, and can be difficult to digest. However, when the apple is peeled and cooked down into a sauce, the cellulose structures are broken down by heat,
making sugars and nutrients accessible without the mechanical work of digestion. Like bananas, apples are rich in pectin. The gelling property of pectin is the reason it is used to set jams and jellies. In the human gut, it performs the exact same function, gelling the liquid contents of the intestine to reduce the watery nature of the stool. Applesauce also provides a source of fructose and glucose for energy. However, the sweetness of applesauce serves a dual purpose: palatability. When a patient, particularly a child, is nauseous and refusing food, the mild sweetness of applesauce can often bypass the aversion to eating, providing a critical bridge back to solid food intake. Finally, toast. The specification of toast rather than bread is scientifically significant. The application of dry heat to bread triggers the Maillard reaction, a chemical interaction between amino acids and reducing sugars that gives brown food its distinctive flavor. More importantly, toasting dehydrates the bread and breaks down some of the starch chains into dextrins, which are shorter and easier to digest than the complex starches found in raw dough. White bread is preferred over whole wheat for the same reason white rice is preferred: low fiber. Toast acts as a bulk-forming agent. It serves as a bland, dry solid that can help settle a sour stomach by absorbing excess gastric acid. For generations, dry toast has been the first solid food reintroduced after a bout of vomiting, a tentative test to see if the stomach has stabilized enough to resume its duties. However, the brat diet is currently the subject of a massive reevaluation within the medical community. While it was the standard of care for the latter half of the 20th century, modern organizations like the American Academy of Pediatrics, AAP, and the CDC have moved away from recommending it as the exclusive diet for prolonged
distinct periods. The criticism is nutritional. The brat diet is severely lacking in protein, fat, and micronutrients. It is essentially a diet of sugar and starch. While this is acceptable for the first 24 hours of acute illness, maintaining a patient on the brat diet for several days can lead to a state of starvation, which is counterproductive to healing. The cells of the intestinal lining, the enterocytes, have a rapid turnover rate and require protein and energy to repair themselves after the damage caused by an infection. By depriving the body of protein and healthy fats,
the brat diet may actually prolong the recovery time of the gut mucosa. Furthermore, there is the phenomenon of starvation stools. When a patient consumes a diet that is almost entirely devoid of fat and protein, the bowel movements can remain loose and watery simply because the digestive system is not being challenged enough to trigger normal enzymatic function. The modern clinical consensus is shifting toward a regular diet as tolerated. This approach encourages the reintroduction of lean proteins like boiled chicken or turkey, complex carbohydrates, and vegetables as soon as the patient feels hungry. The idea is that the gut heals faster when it is fed. The brat diet is now viewed less as a complete dietary protocol and more as a transitional phase, a safe harbor for the first few hours of stabilizing the stomach before venturing back out into the open ocean of complete nutrition. Despite the clinical pivot, the psychological power of the brat diet remains immense. There is a deep primal comfort in blandness during illness. When the body feels betrayed by its own internal machinery, the simplicity of white rice and toast feels safe. It is food that does not challenge, does not surprise, and does not overwhelm. The texture is soft, the flavor is mild, and the digestibility is high. This placebo effect, the feeling of being cared for by the diet, plays a non-trivial role in recovery. Stress and anxiety are known to exacerbate gastrointestinal symptoms through the gut-brain axis. By consuming foods that the mind perceives as safe, the patient reduces the autonomic arousal that drives gut motility, potentially easing symptoms through a psychosomatic pathway. In the grand scope of dietary history, the brat diet serves as a fascinating case study in how we manage the vulnerability of the human body. It is a regimen born of observation, parents noticing that these 4 foods were the only things that stayed down, and later validated, then complicated by science. It highlights the tension between the need to stop the symptoms, diarrhea and vomiting, and the need to fuel the recovery. While we may now add boiled chicken, yogurt, and broth to the list, expanding the acronym to CRAM, cereal, rice, apple, milk, or other variations, the core wisdom of the brat diet remains relevant. When the system is broken, simplify the input. It is a lesson in physiological humility, a recognition that sometimes the most sophisticated biological machine on Earth needs to be rebooted with the simplest of fuels.
4. Avoid dairy temporarily. If the brat diet is the shield used to defend the gut, then dairy products are the Trojan horse that can unexpectedly sack the city from within. The advice to avoid dairy temporarily, during and after a bout of diarrhea, is not merely an old wives' tale, it is a directive rooted in the microscopic anatomy of the small intestine and the specific enzymatic vulnerabilities of the human species. To ignore this advice is to risk transforming a short-lived viral infection into a prolonged, agonizing ordeal of gas, bloating, and secondary diarrhea. This phenomenon, known clinically as transient or secondary lactose intolerance, is a temporary metabolic handicap that reveals the fragility of our ability to digest milk, a capability that is tenuous even in the healthiest of times for much of the global population. To understand why dairy becomes a poison during gastroenteritis, one must first understand the architecture of the small intestine. The inner lining of the gut is not smooth. It is covered in millions of microscopic finger-like projections called villi. These villi vastly increase the surface area of the intestine, allowing for the maximum absorption of nutrients. Covering these villi are even smaller projections called microvilli, often referred to as the brush border. This brush border is the engine room of carbohydrate digestion. It is here, at the very tips of these microscopic structures, that the body produces lactase, the specific enzyme required to break down lactose, the primary sugar found in milk. Lactose is a disaccharide, a complex sugar molecule composed of 2 simpler sugars, glucose and galactose. The lactose molecule is too large to pass through the intestinal wall and into the bloodstream. It must be cleaved into its 2 component parts by the lactase enzyme before it can be absorbed. The production of lactase is the Achilles heel of the digestive system during illness. Because the lactase enzyme is located at the extreme tips of the villi, it is the most vulnerable enzyme to intestinal damage. When a pathogen like rotavirus, norovirus, or E. coli sweeps through the gut, it causes inflammation and physical damage to the lining. The villi become blunted, flattened, or sheared off entirely. In this process, the lactase factories are destroyed. The gut may still be able to process proteins and simple sugars, but its ability to break down lactose is temporarily wiped out.
When a person with this temporary lactase deficiency consumes milk, cheese, or ice cream, the lactose passes through the small intestine undigested. It arrives in the colon intact, and this is where the physiological disaster begins. The colon is inhabited by trillions of bacteria that are eager to feast on sugar. When the undigested lactose hits this bacterial colony, fermentation occurs rapidly and violently. The bacteria consume the lactose and produce waste products in the form of gases, hydrogen, carbon dioxide, and methane. This results in the severe bloating, cramping, and flatulence often associated with dairy consumption during illness. But the gas is only half the problem. The presence of undigested lactose in the colon creates a powerful osmotic gradient. Nature abhors a vacuum, and it also abhors an imbalance in solute concentration. The high concentration of sugar molecules in the colon draws water out of the bloodstream and surrounding tissues, flooding the bowel lumen to try and equalize the concentration. This influx of fluid turns the stool watery and increases the volume and pressure within the colon, triggering the defecation reflex. This is known as osmotic diarrhea. Essentially, by drinking milk during a stomach bug, a patient is pouring fuel on the fire, converting a healing gut into a high-pressure fermentation tank that actively pulls water out of the body, worsening dehydration and resetting the recovery clock. The timeline of this secondary lactose intolerance is a critical aspect of patient management. Unlike the viral infection itself, which may clear in a few days, the damage to the villi can take weeks to repair. The gut lining must physically regenerate, new cells must migrate from the crypts of the intestine to the tips of the villi, and these new cells must mature enough to begin synthesizing lactase enzyme again. This process can take anywhere from a few days to several weeks, depending on the severity of the initial infection. Consequently, a patient may feel cured of the flu, drink a glass of milk to celebrate, and immediately suffer a relapse of diarrhea. This often leads to confusion, with patients believing they have been reinfected, when in reality they have simply challenged their gut with a substrate it is not yet equipped to handle. It is important to distinguish this temporary condition from primary lactose intolerance, which is the genetic,
permanent loss of lactase production that occurs in the majority of the world's adult population. However, the symptoms are identical. For those who are already lactose intolerant, the effects are compounded. For those who are normally lactase persistent, able to drink milk, the sudden onset of intolerance can be shocking and confusing. It serves as a reminder of the evolutionary novelty of adult milk consumption. The ability to digest lactose is a genetic mutation that spread in pastoralist societies, but it remains a fragile adaptation that is easily disrupted by disease. There are, however, nuances and exceptions to the no dairy rule. Not all dairy products are created equal in the eyes of an inflamed gut. Yogurt, specifically yogurt containing live and active cultures, Lactobacillus bifidobacterium, presents a unique paradox. While it contains dairy, the bacteria used to ferment the yogurt produce their own lactase enzyme. When these bacteria survive the passage through the stomach, which they often do in the buffered environment of the yogurt, they release this enzyme in the small intestine, effectively digesting the lactose for the host. This autodigestion means that yogurt is often well tolerated even when milk is not. Furthermore, the probiotics in yogurt can aid in recolonizing the gut with beneficial flora, potentially speeding up recovery. Similarly, hard-aged cheeses like cheddar or Parmesan contain negligible amounts of lactose, as the aging process converts the sugar into lactic acid. These may be tolerated in small amounts, providing necessary calories and protein without the osmotic penalty of liquid milk. The implications of this dairy avoidance are particularly fraught in pediatric care, specifically regarding infants. Breast milk contains a significant amount of lactose. However, the medical consensus strongly advises against stopping breastfeeding during diarrheal illness. Breast milk contains a vast arsenal of immunological weapons, antibodies, lactoferrin, and oligosaccharides that fight the infection directly. The benefits of these immune factors vastly outweigh the risk of lactose intolerance. The advice to avoid dairy applies primarily to cow's milk and cow's milk-based formulas. In severe cases of gastroenteritis in formula-fed infants, pediatricians may recommend a temporary switch to a soy-based or lactose-free formula for 2 weeks to allow the gut to heal,
preventing the cycle of feeding-induced diarrhea that can lead to failure to thrive. The cultural impact of this restriction is significant in Western societies where dairy is a staple of the diet. The comfort food instinct often leans toward creamy soups, custards, or warm milk, foods that are chemically contradicted during recovery. Educating patients that their comfort food is actually a chemical irritant is a major hurdle in clinical practice. It requires explaining that digestion is not a passive process, but an enzymatic interaction that requires the body to be in a state of structural integrity. When that integrity is breached, the diet must be stripped back to its elemental forms. Ultimately, the directive to avoid dairy temporarily is a lesson in timing and biological readiness. It teaches us that recovery is not a binary switch, sick or well, but a gradient of restoration. The return of the appetite does not always signal the return of enzymatic capacity. The villi must be rebuilt, the brush border restored, and the chemical factories brought back online before the complex task of digesting bovine milk can resume. Until that reconstruction is complete, dairy remains a metabolic challenge that the weakened body simply cannot meet, transforming a source of nourishment into an agent of distress. By respecting this biological limit, we allow the gut the silence and space it needs to reconstruct the delicate architecture of digestion.
5. Avoid greasy, spicy, and sugary foods. The dietary landscape of the modern world is a minefield of hyperpalatable, chemically complex, and industrially processed substances that, while pleasurable in health, become active combatants against the body during an episode of gastroenteritis. The directive to avoid greasy, spicy, and sugary foods is not merely a suggestion of moderation, it is a tactical necessity derived from the understanding of gastrointestinal motility, osmotic pressure, and mechanical sensitivity of the mucosal lining. When the gut is inflamed, its tolerance for chemical complexity drops to near zero. Foods that normally stimulate digestion transform into irritants that accelerate the very symptoms the patient is desperate to halt. To consume a slice of pepperoni pizza or a high-fructose soda during a bout of diarrhea is akin to pouring gasoline on a smoldering fire. It triggers a cascade of physiological reflexes that override the body's attempts to heal, perpetuating the cycle of inflammation and fluid loss. The first category of prohibited substances, greasy or fatty foods, presents a massive mechanical challenge to a compromised digestive system. In a healthy state, the digestion of lipids, fats, is the most labor-intensive process the gut undertakes. Unlike carbohydrates, which break down relatively easily, fats are hydrophobic. They do not mix with the watery environment of the intestine. To digest a cheeseburger or fried chicken, the body must orchestrate a complex ballet involving the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. The gallbladder must contract to release bile, which emulsifies the fat into tiny droplets, while the pancreas must secrete lipase enzymes to break these droplets down chemically. However, during an infection like viral gastroenteritis, this machinery is often out of sync. The inflammation of the intestinal lining can disrupt the signaling that triggers bile release, or the rapid transit time of the diarrhea means the food moves too fast for the enzymes to catch up. The consequence of eating fat during diarrhea is a phenomenon known as steatorrhea, the excretion of undigested fat. Because the fat is not absorbed, it remains in the intestinal lumen, where it acts as a lubricant and an irritant. But the mechanism goes deeper. The presence of fat in the duodenum, the first part of the small intestine, stimulates a powerful physiological trigger called the gastrocolic reflex.
This is the body's signal to the colon to make room for new food by evacuating its current contents. In a healthy person, this might result in a mild urge to use the restroom after a heavy meal. In a person with diarrhea, where the colon is already hypersensitive and spasmodic, the gastrocolic reflex induced by a greasy meal can trigger violent, explosive bowel movements immediately after eating. The colon, sensing the influx of difficult-to-digest lipids, essentially panics and dumps its contents. This is why comfort foods like fried chicken soup or buttery mashed potatoes often lead to an immediate worsening of symptoms. The gut is signaling that it is currently incapable of the heavy lifting required to process lipids. The second category, spicy foods, attacks the gut through a different neurochemical pathway. The active component in chili peppers, capsaicin, is an evolutionary defense mechanism designed by plants to discourage mammals from eating their fruit. In humans, capsaicin binds to a specific receptor called TRPV1, transient receptor potential vanilloid 1. These receptors are found on the tongue, where they register heat and pain, but they are also abundant throughout the lining of the gastrointestinal tract. When a person with a healthy gut eats spicy food, the burning sensation is usually confined to the mouth and perhaps the exit. However, during diarrhea, the protective mucosal layer of the intestine is often thinned or stripped away, exposing the sensitive nerve endings in the gut wall. When capsaicin hits these exposed TRPV1 receptors in an inflamed gut, it triggers a visceral hypersensitivity reaction. The body interprets the chemical heat as physical damage. In response, the enteric nervous system, the brain in the gut, orders an immediate evacuation to expel the offending substance. This results in a rapid increase in peristalsis, the wave-like muscle contractions that move food through the digestive tract. For a patient trying to stop diarrhea, this acceleration is disastrous. It reduces the time available for water absorption and causes severe abdominal cramping. Furthermore, the inflammation caused by the spice can increase the permeability of the intestinal wall, potentially allowing toxins or bacteria to cross into the bloodstream, a condition colloquially known as leaky gut. The burning sensation experienced during defecation is the final insult.
A sign that the capsaicin has passed through the entire system virtually untouched, scorching the inflamed tissues of the rectum on its way out. The third and perhaps most insidious category is sugary foods. This includes not only candy and desserts, but also fruit juices, sodas, and many sports drinks. The danger here lies in the physics of osmosis. The cells of the intestine rely on a delicate balance of sodium and glucose to absorb water. However, this system has a capacity limit. When a large load of simple sugar, particularly fructose, enters the small intestine, the transporters that move sugar into the blood can become overwhelmed. This is common in a condition known as fructose malabsorption, which is exacerbated during illness. When the sugar cannot be absorbed, it stays in the gut. This undigested sugar turns the interior of the intestine into a hypertonic environment, meaning the concentration of dissolved particles is higher inside the gut than in the surrounding blood vessels. Nature constantly seeks equilibrium. To dilute this concentrated sugar solution, the body pulls water out of the bloodstream and into the intestine. This is the dumping syndrome effect. The result is osmotic diarrhea, watery, high-volume stools that occur shortly after consuming sugar. High-fructose corn syrup, the ubiquitous sweetener in the American diet, is a particularly potent offender because fructose is absorbed less efficiently than glucose. A single can of soda can dump enough fructose into the system to overwhelm a sick gut, turning a hydration attempt into a dehydration event. This warning extends to the modern realm of sugar-free foods. Artificial sweeteners, particularly sugar alcohols like sorbitol, mannitol, and xylitol, found in sugar-free gum, diet candies, and some protein bars, are chemically designed to be indigestible. That is how they provide sweetness without calories. They pass through the body unabsorbed. However, because they are not absorbed, they arrive in the colon intact. There, There, they serve as a feast for the colonic bacteria, which ferment them rapidly. This fermentation produces massive amounts of gas, hydrogen and methane, and short-chain fatty acids. This process distends the bowel, causing bloating and pain, and the presence of the sugar alcohols draws yet more water into the colon. The infamous reviews of sugar-free gummy bears on Amazon are not hyperbole. They are graphic documentations of the laxative power of polyols,
which can induce diarrhea even in a healthy person, let alone one already suffering from a gastrointestinal infection. The cultural implication of avoiding these foods is a confrontation with the Western diet. Our modern food environment is engineered for hyperpalatability, dominated by the bliss point, the precise combination of salt, sugar, and fat that override satiety signals. When we are sick, we crave these foods because our brain associates them with high energy and comfort. We want the ice cream because it is cold and sweet. We want the fast food because it is salty. Resisting these cravings requires a conscious override of our instincts. It requires understanding that the digestive system is currently in a wartime economy. It cannot process the luxury goods of the modern diet. It can only handle the basic rations. Furthermore, the impact of these foods is not just immediate, it can delay long-term recovery. The inflammation caused by spicy foods, the osmotic stress caused by sugar, and the enzymatic strain caused by fats can prevent the intestinal villi from healing. This can lead to a post-infectious irritable bowel syndrome, PIIBS, where gastrointestinal symptoms persist for months after the initial infection has cleared. The gut remains twitchy, hypersensitive to certain foods because it was never allowed to fully rest and regenerate during the acute phase of the illness. Ultimately, the exclusion of greasy, spicy, and sugary foods is an exercise in gut rest. It is about removing the variables that require high-energy processing. It is a recognition that digestion is a chemical reaction that requires a specific environment to function. When that environment is disrupted by disease, adding complex reactants like lipids, capsaicin, or concentrated fructose inevitably leads to a volatile reaction. By adhering to a bland, simple diet, the patient removes the chemical stressors, allowing the body to redirect its limited energy reserves toward the vital tasks of immune defense and tissue repair. It is a temporary austerity measure that pays dividends in the speed and completeness of recovery.
6. Take probiotics. If antibiotics are the nuclear option that carpet bombs the bacterial landscape of the body, then probiotics are the elite reconstruction crews parachuted in to rebuild the civilization. The recommendation to take probiotics during and after a diarrheal episode represents a fundamental shift in our understanding of human biology, from the germ theory of the 19th century, which viewed all bacteria as enemies to be eradicated, to the microbiome theory of the 21st century, which recognizes that we are essentially walking ecosystems. Diarrhea is often a symptom of an ecological collapse within the colon. The good bacteria have been overrun by pathogens or flushed out by the sheer volume of fluid loss. Taking probiotics is an attempt to artificially reinforce the friendly lines, reseeding the gut with beneficial flora to restore order to the chaotic microbial universe within. The science of probiotics is rooted in the concept of colonization resistance. A healthy human gut contains trillions of bacteria, weighing up to 2 kilograms, an organ in its own right. These bacteria line the intestinal walls like a dense forest. When a pathogen like Salmonella or Clostridium difficile enters the gut, it struggles to find a place to attach because the parking spots on the intestinal wall are already taken by the beneficial bacteria. This is competitive exclusion. However, during diarrhea, this forest is raised. The protective layer is washed away, leaving the intestinal wall exposed and vulnerable to invasion. Probiotics, specifically strains like Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG, LGG, and Saccharomyces boulardii, act as temporary placeholders. They flood the zone, occupying the receptor sites on the gut wall and preventing the pathogens from gaining a foothold while the native microbiome recovers. But the action of probiotics is more sophisticated than simply crowding out the bad guys. These beneficial microorganisms engage in active biological warfare. Many probiotic strains produce substances called bacteriocins, potent protein toxins that specifically target and kill pathogenic bacteria. They also lower the pH of the gut by producing lactic acid, creating an acidic environment that is hospitable to beneficial flora but hostile to many disease-causing invaders. Furthermore, probiotics communicate directly with the host's immune system. They interact with dendritic cells in the gut lining, signaling the body to ramp up the production of IgA,
an antibody that plays a crucial role in immune function at mucous membranes. Essentially, probiotics act as drill sergeants, training the immune system to react faster and more effectively to threats. The history of probiotics is surprisingly deep, dating back to the early 20th century and the Nobel Prize-winning work of Elie Metchnikoff. He observed that Bulgarian peasants who consumed large quantities of fermented milk, yogurt, lived unusually long lives. He hypothesized that the lactic acid bacteria in the yogurt were neutralizing the putrefactive bacteria in the gut. While his theories were initially dismissed with the advent of antibiotics, the pendulum has swung back violently. Today, the specific yeast Saccharomyces boulardii has a legendary origin story. It was discovered in the 1920s by French microbiologist Henri Boulard in Indochina. He noticed that during a cholera outbreak, the locals who drank a tea made from the skin of lychee and mangosteen fruits did not succumb to the disease. He isolated the yeast responsible for this protection. Today, S. boulardii is the only yeast probiotic proven to be effective against antibiotic-associated diarrhea and C. diff infections.
Because it is a yeast, not a bacterium, it is naturally resistant to antibiotics, allowing patients to take it simultaneously with antibiotic courses to protect the gut. However, the world of probiotics is also a wild west of unregulated commerce. Not all probiotics are created equal. The efficacy of a probiotic depends entirely on the specific strain, the dose, and the survivability. A generic bottle labeled probiotic at a gas station is likely useless. The bacteria must be alive when consumed, and they must survive the treacherous journey through the hydrochloric acid bath of the stomach and the bile salts of the small intestine to reach the colon. Many inferior products contain dead bacteria, or strains that are destroyed by digestion before they can do any good. Clinical efficacy requires specific studied strains, like Lactobacillus reuteri or Bifidobacterium lactis, delivered in dosages measured in the billions of CFUs, colony-forming units. The distinction between a clinical-grade probiotic and a marketing gimmick is often the difference between recovery and wasted money. The consumption of probiotics can be achieved through supplements or whole foods. Fermented foods are the ancestral delivery system. Yogurt with live and active cultures,
Kefir, a fermented milk drink, kimchi, sauerkraut, and miso are packed with beneficial microbes. These foods offer a matrix of protection. The proteins and fats in the food help buffer the bacteria against stomach acid, increasing their survival rate. Yogurt in particular has been shown to reduce the duration of infectious diarrhea in children by nearly a day. It is a functional food in the truest sense. However, for acute medical conditions, food sources may not provide a high enough dose of the specific strain required to combat a raging infection, which is where concentrated supplements become necessary. The future of probiotic therapy is moving towards extreme personalization and the concept of next-generation probiotics. We are moving beyond lactobacillus. Researchers are investigating anaerobic bacteria like Akkermansia muciniphila, which plays a key role in maintaining the mucus layer of the gut and is linked to metabolic health. We are also on the cusp of the fecal microbiota transplant, or FMT, revolution becoming mainstream. FMT involves taking the entire microbial ecosystem from a healthy donor's stool and transplanting it into a sick patient. While currently reserved for life-threatening C. diff infections, trials are underway to use this ultimate probiotic for conditions ranging from irritable bowel syndrome to ulcerative colitis. This acknowledges that a single strain of bacteria is rarely a magic bullet. The power lies in the diversity and complexity of the entire community. There is also a fascinating emerging field known as psychobiotics. Because the gut and the brain are connected via the vagus nerve, the gut-brain axis, the state of the microbiome affects mental health. Chronic diarrhea and gut inflammation are strongly linked to anxiety and depression. By restoring the gut flora with specific probiotics, researchers have been able to lower cortisol levels and improve mood in clinical trials. This suggests that treating diarrhea with probiotics isn't just about firming up stool, it's about stabilizing the patient's mental state during the stress of illness. Despite the promise, caution is required. In severely immunocompromised patients, such as those with organ transplants or advanced HIV, probiotics can theoretically cause opportunistic infections. The good bacteria can enter the bloodstream and cause sepsis. It is a rare paradox where the cure becomes the disease. Therefore,
While probiotics are generally safe for the vast majority, they are biologically active agents that should be treated with the respect due to any medication. In the final analysis, the use of probiotics to treat diarrhea is a strategy of ecological restoration. It acknowledges that the human body is not a sterile vessel, but a host to a vast invisible nation of symbionts. Diarrhea is a natural disaster that devastates this nation. By introducing probiotics, we are providing disaster relief, food, reinforcements, and infrastructure repair. It is a therapy that works with the grain of evolution, leveraging the ancient alliance between human and microbe to restore the balance of health. As we look to the future, the manipulation of this inner ecosystem may prove to be the most significant frontier in preventative medicine. But for now, it remains one of the most effective tools for shortening the misery of acute gastrointestinal illness.
7. Rest and avoid heavy activity. The prescription to rest is often dismissed in our hyperkinetic, productivity-obsessed modern culture as a suggestion of comfort rather than a clinical mandate. However, in the context of acute gastroenteritis, rest is not a luxury, it is a metabolic imperative dictated by the laws of hemodynamics and immunology. To understand why physical stillness is required to treat diarrhea, one must delve into the complex economy of the human body's energy distribution and the autonomic nervous system's binary operating modes. The body is a biological machine with a finite energy budget. When it is under attack by a pathogen, the immune system requires a massive reallocation of resources. Every calorie burned on a treadmill, every ounce of focus directed toward a stressful work email, and every physiological demand of locomotion is a resource stolen from the vital work of intestinal repair. The directive to avoid heavy activity is at its core a command to enforce a state of biological austerity, funneling all available energy toward the singular goal of survival and systemic reconstruction.
The primary physiological mechanism at play here is the redistribution of blood flow, governed by the autonomic nervous system. This system has two primary divisions, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic system is the fight or flight mechanism. When a person engages in heavy activity, exercise, or experiences high stress, this system activates. It floods the body with adrenaline and cortisol, and crucially, it shuns blood away from the internal organs, specifically the splanchnic bed, which supplies the stomach and intestines, and redirects it toward the skeletal muscles, heart, and lungs. This is an evolutionary adaptation designed to help humans outrun predators. Digestion is a low priority when one is about to be eaten. However, during an episode of diarrhea, the gut is inflamed, damaged, and desperate for oxygen and nutrients to repair the mucosal lining. When a patient suffering from diarrhea attempts to power through with exercise or heavy labor, they are inducing a state of relative ischemia, lack of blood flow, in an already compromised organ. The sympathetic activation clamps down on the blood vessels feeding the gut. This lack of perfusion can exacerbate the damage to the intestinal wall, increase the permeability of the gut lining, leaky gut, and worsen cramping.
In extreme cases, this can mimic the phenomenon known as runner's diarrhea or ischemic colitis, where the gut lining essentially dies off due to lack of blood flow and sloughs off, leading to bloody stools. By resting, the patient allows the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest mode, to take dominance. This dilates the blood vessels in the abdomen, bathing the injured tissues in oxygen-rich blood, delivering the white blood cells needed to fight the infection and the nutrients needed to rebuild the villi. Furthermore, the concept of sickness behavior provides a profound evolutionary perspective on the necessity of rest. Lethargy, fatigue, and a desire to lie down are not merely symptoms of the illness. They are an orchestrated biological response driven by cytokines. When immune cells, macrophages, detect a pathogen, they release signaling proteins like interleukin-1, IL-1, and tumor necrosis factor alpha, TNF-alpha. These cytokines travel to the brain and interact with the hypothalamus, triggering a profound sense of fatigue and social withdrawal. This is a deliberate evolutionary strategy. By forcing the organism to stop moving, the body conserves the immense amount of caloric energy usually spent on foraging and movement, redirecting it to the fever response. A fever is metabolically expensive. For every degree centigrade the body temperature rises, the metabolic rate increases by approximately 10 to 12%. If a patient fights this cytokine-induced lethargy with caffeine or sheer willpower, they are effectively embezzling funds from the immune system, prolonging the infection and the duration of the diarrhea. The definition of heavy activity in this context extends beyond the gymnasium. It encompasses the physiological stress of thermal regulation and the cognitive load of modern life. Exposure to extreme heat or cold forces the body to expend energy on maintaining homeostasis, diverting resources from the gut. Similarly, high-stress mental activity triggers the same sympathetic fight-or-flight catecholamine release as physical danger. The gut-brain axis, the bidirectional communication highway between the central nervous system and the enteric nervous system, means that mental stress translates directly into gastrointestinal motility. Stress hormones like corticotropin-releasing factor, CRF, can stimulate colonic motility, effectively pushing the eject button on the bowel. Therefore,
rest implies not just physical recumbency, but a reduction in sensory and cognitive input. It is a neurological shielding of the gut from the stressors of the outside world. The role of sleep in this equation is paramount and distinct from mere rest. During deep, slow-wave sleep, the body enters its most active anabolic, building state. It is during sleep that the secretion of growth hormone peaks, facilitating the repair of the epithelial cells lining the intestine. Furthermore, the immune system is nocturnal in its efficiency. The production of antibodies and the differentiation of T cells are upregulated during sleep cycles. Sleep deprivation, conversely, is a pro-inflammatory state. A lack of sleep increases the levels of systemic inflammation markers like C-reactive protein. For a patient with an inflamed colon, losing sleep is akin to removing the scaffolding from a building under repair. The advice to sleep it off is scientifically sound. The unconscious body is a more efficient healing machine than the conscious one. There is also a mechanical argument for avoiding heavy activity. Physical movement, particularly high-impact activities like running or jumping, physically jostles the abdominal contents. In a healthy gut, this is negligible. In a fluid-filled distended bowel, this mechanical agitation can trigger the mechanoreceptors in the intestinal wall, stimulating peristalsis and urgency. The simple act of gravity also plays a role. Being in a supine, lying down position reduces the hydrostatic pressure in the lower abdomen and pelvis, potentially reducing the sensation of urgency and allowing the anal sphincter muscles, which are often exhausted and sore from frequent use, use to relax. The cultural resistance to this advice is a significant public health hurdle. We live in a society that valorizes presenteeism, the act of showing up to work or school despite illness. The pharmaceutical industry facilitates this with advertisements showing people taking medication and immediately returning to high-powered corporate meetings or sporting events. This narrative is biologically dangerous. It encourages the suppression of symptoms while ignoring the underlying physiological crisis. The hustle culture that views downtime as wasted time is incompatible with the biological reality of infectious disease. Ignoring the body's demand for rest can lead to complications such as post-infectious fatigue syndrome,
where the exhaustion lingers for weeks after the diarrhea has stopped, a punishment for the failure to heed the initial warning signs. Looking to the future, the integration of wearable technology may change how we approach this aspect of treatment. Smartwatches and recovery trackers that measure heart rate variability, HRV, can now quantify the body's stress load. A plummeting HRV score is a clear, objective indicator that the autonomic nervous system is overwhelmed. In the future, rest may not be a vague suggestion, but a data-driven prescription, with devices warning patients that their recovery battery is critically low and that any exertion will result in a prolonged illness. Until then, the patient must rely on the oldest signal in biology, pain and fatigue. Ultimately, the mandate to rest is a lesson in humility. It is an acknowledgement that despite our technological advancements and intellectual dominance, we are biological entities subject to the laws of thermodynamics. When the system is breached, the shutters must come down. By ceasing activity, we stop the sympathetic theft of blood flow, we honor the cytokine signals of the immune system, and we provide the metabolic silence necessary for the intricate, energy-intensive work of knitting the intestinal barrier back together. In the war against diarrhea, stillness is not a surrender. It is the most effective siege tactic available.
8. Use antidiarrheal medicine carefully. The use of antidiarrheal medication, specifically loperamide, commonly known by the brand name Imodium, represents one of the most powerful yet potentially perilous interventions in the management of gastrointestinal illness. It is the ability to chemically hit the pause button on the digestive tract. While this capability is a triumph of modern pharmacology, offering relief from the debilitating urgency and social paralysis of diarrhea, it is a tool that must be wielded with the precision of a surgeon. Misuse of these drugs does not merely fail to cure the patient, it can transform a manageable infection into a life-threatening catastrophe. To understand why, one must explore the pharmacological ancestry of these drugs, their mechanism of action on the opioid receptors of the gut, and the terrifying pathology of toxic megacolon. Loperamide is, chemically speaking, a synthetic opioid. It is a structural relative of potent narcotics like fentanyl and methadone. However, it possesses a unique chemical engineering trait that makes it available over the counter. It acts peripherally, not centrally. When ingested, loperamide binds avidly to the mu-opioid receptors located in the myenteric plexus, the complex network of nerves sandwiched between the muscle layers of the intestinal wall. In the brain, activating mu-opioid receptors produces euphoria and pain relief. In the gut, activating these receptors causes paralysis. Specifically, it inhibits the release of acetylcholine and prostaglandins, the chemical messengers that tell the smooth muscles of the intestine to contract. By binding to these receptors, loperamide halts peristalsis, the wave-like muscle contractions that propel food and stool through the digestive tract. The gut effectively goes to sleep. This cessation of movement has two major effects. First, it stops the immediate urgency to defecate. Second, and more importantly, it drastically increases the transit time of the fecal matter. By holding the stool in the intestine for a longer period, the drug gives the mucosal lining more time to reabsorb water and electrolytes. This transforms liquid watery diarrhea into solid stool. It also increases the tone of the anal sphincter, reducing incontinence. It is a highly effective plumbing fix. However, the carefully in the instruction is vital because diarrhea is often not just a malfunction, it is a defense mechanism.
This is the flush theory of gastroenteritis. When the gut is infected with a pathogen like Salmonella, Shigella, or Campylobacter, or invaded by a toxin, the body induces diarrhea to physically expel the invader. It is a biological purge. By taking an anti-motility drug like loperamide, the patient is effectively boarding up the exit doors while the building is on fire. This leads to the phenomenon of sequestration. The bacteria, toxins, and inflammatory fluids that the body is trying to eject are trapped inside the lumen of the bowel. This entrapment can lead to disastrous consequences. If the pathogen is invasive, meaning it tries to burrow into the intestinal wall, trapping it there gives it unlimited time to invade. This can lead to the bacteria entering the bloodstream, causing sepsis, blood poisoning. Even more terrifying is the risk of toxic megacolon. In this condition, the colon becomes so paralyzed and distended with trapped gas, fluid, and toxins that it loses all structural integrity. It swells like an overinflated balloon. The walls become paper-thin and can rupture, perforate, spilling fecal contents into the sterile abdominal cavity.
This causes peritonitis, a catastrophic infection with a high mortality rate that requires emergency surgery to remove the colon. This is why the medical guidelines for loperamide are rigid. It acts as a stop sign, but only for specific traffic. It is generally safe for non-infectious diarrhea, like IBS, or mild traveler's diarrhea, where there are no alarm symptoms. However, it is strictly contraindicated if there is fever, indicating a systemic infection, or blood or mucus in the stool, dysentery. Blood in the stool implies that the bacteria are already destroying the intestinal lining. Paralyzing the gut in this scenario is akin to aiding and abetting the enemy. In cases of Clostridioides difficile, C. diff infection, a severe bacterial infection often caused by antibiotic use, antidiarrheals are absolutely forbidden, as they are a known precipitant of toxic megacolon. There is an alternative class of antidiarrheals that operates on a different principle, bismuth subsalicylate, known famously as Pepto-Bismol. This pink liquid is a chemical compound of bismuth and salicylic acid, a cousin of aspirin. Its mechanism is antisecretorial and antimicrobial rather than paralytic. The bismuth moiety coats the lining of the stomach and intestine, protecting it from acid and toxins.
And has a direct bactericidal effect. It kills bacteria. The salicylate portion reduces inflammation and inhibits the secretion of fluid into the gut. Because it does not paralyze the bowel, bismuth subsalicylate is generally considered safer than loperamide in cases where the cause of the diarrhea is unknown, although it is less potent at stopping the flow immediately. It carries its own quirks, such as turning the tongue and stool black, a harmless chemical reaction with sulfur, which can terrify patients who mistake it for internal bleeding. A darker chapter in the history of antidiarrheals involves the opioid crisis. Because loperamide is an opioid, it was long believed to be abuse-proof because the P-glycoprotein pump at the blood-brain barrier actively pumps it out of the brain before it can cause a high. However, in recent years, desperate individuals suffering from opioid withdrawal discovered that consuming massive, toxic doses of loperamide, 50 to 100 pills at once, could overwhelm this pump and force the drug into the brain. This practice, known as poor man's methadone, has led to a spike in overdose deaths. The mechanism of death is often cardiac. High doses of loperamide disrupt the electrical signaling of the heart, QT prolongation, causing sudden cardiac arrest. This has forced the FDA to limit the packaging size of loperamide to prevent bulk purchases, a sobering reminder that even the most mundane pharmacy items carry potent chemical risks. Historically, the use of opioids for diarrhea is one of the oldest medical practices in existence. In the 19th century and earlier, the primary treatment for dysentery was laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol. It was a crude, addictive, but effective way to stop the bowel. The synthesis of loperamide in 1969 by Paul Janssen was an attempt to separate the antidiarrheal effect from the addictive high. It was a masterpiece of medicinal chemistry, effectively declawing the opioid molecule to create a safe consumer product. Yet the biological risk of stasis remains. The decision to use antidiarrheal medicine requires a risk-benefit analysis. For a business executive about to board a transatlantic flight or a bride on her wedding day, the social necessity of stopping diarrhea may outweigh the physiological risk of retaining the pathogen. In these cases, loperamide is a miracle drug. But for the patient at home with a fever, severe cramps, and bloody stool,
The bottle should remain closed. The symptoms, as unpleasant as they are the body's method of sanitation. Future developments in this field are looking towards smart antidiarrheals, drugs that can target the specific ion channels responsible for fluid secretion, like CFTR inhibitors, without paralyzing the muscles. These would stop the water loss without stopping the flush, theoretically offering the best of both worlds, preventing dehydration while allowing the pathogen to be expelled. Until such drugs are widely available, loperamide remains the standard, a powerful cattle dam that can hold back the flood, provided the user understands the pressure building up behind the wall. It is a testament to the complexity of the body that sometimes the most effective treatment is to do nothing and let the purge run its course, while the most dangerous intervention is to simply make it stop.
9. Practice good hygiene. In the theater of infectious disease, the patient is not merely a victim, they are an active biological radiator of contagion. While the previous entries have focused on the internal management of the host, stabilizing fluids, soothing the gut, and restoring the microbiome, entry number 9 pivots to the external environment. It addresses the terrifying efficiency of the fecal-oral route of transmission, a pathway that has decimated civilizations and continues to fuel outbreaks on cruise ships, in daycare centers, and within households globally. Practice good hygiene is a deceptively simple phrase that masks a rigorous, almost military protocol of containment required to arrest the spread of microscopic pathogens that are evolved specifically to exploit our lapses in sanitation. To treat diarrhea effectively is to contain it. Failure to do so transforms a single case into a cluster and a cluster into an epidemic. The biological reality of diarrheal pathogens is that they are masters of environmental survival. Consider norovirus, the leading cause of viral gastroenteritis. It is a non-enveloped virus, meaning it lacks the fragile lipid coating that makes viruses like SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, susceptible to hand sanitizers and heat. The norovirus capsid is a protein armor, resilient against freezing, heating to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, and even mild chlorination. Furthermore, it possesses a terrifyingly low infectious dose. While some bacteria require the ingestion of thousands of cells to trigger infection, a human can be infected with norovirus by ingesting as few as 18 viral particles. To put this in perspective, a single gram of stool from an infected person can contain up to 100 billion viral copies. This mathematical asymmetry, billions of bullets against a defense that crumbles after 18 hits, means that the home of a diarrheal patient is effectively a biohazard zone. The invisible fecal veneer settles on doorknobs, remote controls, and light switches, lying in wait for the next host. The epicenter of this containment battle is the bathroom, specifically the phenomenon known as the toilet plume. Physics dictates that when a modern toilet is flushed, the turbulence creates a massive aerosolization event. High-speed video analysis and laser scattering studies have demonstrated that a flush can launch thousands of microscopic water droplets laden with fecal bacteria and viral particles up to 6 feet into the air.
These aerosols hang in the room for hours, settling on toothbrushes, towels, and surfaces. If the patient flushes with the lid up, they are effectively crop dusting the bathroom with the very pathogen that is killing them. The first rule of hygienic containment, therefore, is mechanical. Close the lid before flushing. This simple barrier reduces the aerosol dispersion by orders of magnitude, trapping the particulate matter within the bowl where it belongs. However, the primary vector of transmission remains the human hand. The history of hand hygiene is written in blood, most notably in the tragic story of Ignaz Semmelweis, the 19th century Hungarian obstetrician. Semmelweis discovered that doctors were transferring cadaverous particles from autopsy rooms to delivery rooms, causing fatal puerperal fever in new mothers. He was ridiculed and ostracized for suggesting that hand washing could save lives, dying in an asylum before his germ theory was vindicated by Pasteur and Lister. Today, we understand the chemistry of why soap works, and it is a marvel of molecular engineering. Soap molecules are amphiphiles. They possess a hydrophilic, water-loving head and a hydrophobic, water-hating tail. When a person washes their hands, the hydrophobic tails burrow into the lipid membranes of bacteria and enveloped viruses, prying them apart like a crowbar. Simultaneously, the soap molecules surround dirt and viral particles, forming spherical structures called micelles that trap the pathogens in water, allowing them to be rinsed away. This brings us to a critical, often fatal, misunderstanding in modern hygiene, the reliance on alcohol-based hand sanitizers. While effective against respiratory viruses and many bacteria, alcohol gel is notoriously ineffective against non-enveloped viruses like norovirus and Clostridioides difficile C. diff spores. The protein shell of norovirus is impervious to alcohol. The virus simply floats in the gel, waiting to be transferred to the next surface or mouth. For a household managing a diarrheal illness, relying on hand sanitizer is a tactical error. Rigorous hand washing with soap and warm water for at least 20 seconds, the time it takes to sing happy birthday twice, is the only method that physically dislodges and washes away these armored pathogens. The mechanical friction of rubbing the hands together is just as important as the chemical action of the soap. Surface decontamination requires a similarly aggressive approach.
Standard household cleaners are often insufficient against the hardy pathogens responsible for diarrhea. A solution of bleach, sodium hypochlorite, is the gold standard. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, recommends a solution of 5 to 25 tablespoons of household bleach per gallon of water for disinfecting surfaces contaminated with norovirus. This chemical warfare is necessary to break down the viral capsid. Particular attention must be paid to high-touch surfaces that are often overlooked: the handle of the toilet flush, the faucet caps, which are touched with dirty hands before washing and clean hands after, and the handles of the refrigerator. The laundry creates another vector. Soiled linens and clothes should be handled with gloves and washed on the longest cycle with the hottest water available, then machine dried on high heat. The heat of the dryer is a critical sterilization step. The concept of cohorting is also vital in a multi-person household. Ideally, the sick individual should have exclusive use of a designated bathroom. If this is impossible, the bathroom must be disinfected after every single use by the patient. This imposes a heavy burden on the caregiver, who acts as the line of defense between the patient and the rest of the family. The caregiver must adopt a mindset of clinical detachment, treating every interaction with the patient or their environment as a potential contamination event. This includes the preparation of food. It is an absolute imperative that a person suffering from diarrhea or recovering from it does not prepare food for others for at least 48 hours after symptoms have ceased. The Typhoid Mary scenario, where an asymptomatic carrier sheds bacteria into food, is a historical lesson in how easily a single cook can infect a multitude.
The psychological dimension of hygiene during illness is one of vigilance and altruism. It requires the patient to be hyper-aware of their own bioburden. It involves the awkward but necessary social contract of refusing to shake hands, sleeping in a separate room, and maintaining distance. It is a recognition that the body is currently a factory for disease. In the broader scope of public health, hygiene is the infrastructure of civilization. The Great Stink of London in 1858 and the subsequent construction of the sewer system by Joseph Bazalgette prove that managing waste is the prerequisite for a functional society. On a micro level,
Treating diarrhea is about managing that waste within the home. Looking to the future, the hygiene of the home is set to be revolutionized by technology. We are entering the era of self-cleaning surfaces. Material scientists are developing antimicrobial coatings using copper alloys and shark skin-inspired textures that physically rupture bacteria on contact or prevent them from adhering. Smart bathrooms will likely feature toilets that automatically close their lids before flushing and utilize UVC light to sterilize the bowl and seat between uses. Touchless faucets and soap dispensers, once the domain of airport restrooms, are becoming standard in residential design. However, until these technologies are ubiquitous, the defense against the fecal-oral route relies on the discipline of the individual. Ultimately, practicing good hygiene is not a passive background activity. It is an active, aggressive component of the treatment plan. It limits the viral load in the environment, reducing the chance of reinfection, yes, you can reinfect yourself, and protecting the herd of the household. It acknowledges that while the immune system fights the war on the inside, soap, bleach, and gravity fight the war on the outside. Without this external containment, the treatment of the individual is a Sisyphean task, doomed to be repeated as the pathogen cycles endlessly through the family unit.
10. See a doctor when warning signs appear. The final entry in this dossier serves as the failsafe, the critical juncture when self-management ends and professional medical intervention must begin. While the human body is remarkably resilient, capable of weathering most gastrointestinal storms with the supportive care outlined in the previous 9 entries, there is a distinct physiological tipping point where the infection outpaces the body's ability to compensate. Recognizing this moment, the transition from a miserable inconvenience to a medical emergency is a skill that saves lives. The directive to see a doctor is not an admission of defeat, it is a strategic escalation of force, bringing the full weight of modern diagnostics, pharmacology, and resuscitation science to bear against a pathogen that threatens to overwhelm the systemic functions of life. The first and most urgent warning sign is the sign of decompensated shock, primarily driven by severe dehydration. The human body is essentially a hydraulic machine. When the fluid volume drops below a critical level, the pressure required to perfuse the organs plummets. In the early stages of dehydration, the body compensates. The heart beats faster, tachycardia, to maintain pressure, and the blood vessels constrict. However, if the fluid loss from diarrhea continues unchecked, these mechanisms fail. The patient may exhibit confusion, lethargy, or unconsciousness, signs that the brain is being starved of oxygen. The skin loses its elasticity, turgor, remaining tented when pinched. The eyes appear sunken into their orbits due to the shrinkage of the fat pads behind them. In infants, the soft spot on the head, fontanelle, may depress. This is hypovolemic shock. At this stage, drinking water is insufficient. The gut is too compromised to absorb fluid fast enough to save the kidneys and heart. The patient requires intravenous IV resuscitation, the direct injection of saline or Ringer's lactate into the bloodstream to forcibly repressurize the system. This is a procedure that can only be performed by medical professionals. The second red flag is dysentery, the presence of blood or mucus in the stool. This transforms the diagnosis from secretory diarrhea, water loss, to inflammatory diarrhea, tissue destruction. Blood indicates that the pathogen is not merely sitting on the surface of the gut, it is invading the mucosa, burrowing into the intestinal wall and rupturing blood vessels.
Pathogens like Shigella, Campylobacter, and Entamoeba histolytica are notorious for this. Of particular concern is E. coli 0157H7, a bacterium that produces a potent Shiga toxin. This toxin can enter the bloodstream and attack the kidneys, leading to a life-threatening condition called hemolytic uremic syndrome, HUS, which causes kidney failure and the destruction of red blood cells. If a patient sees blood, taking anti-diarrheals like loperamide is strictly forbidden, as it traps the toxin inside. Immediate medical evaluation is required to identify the specific organism and initiate the correct antibiotic protocol, or in the case of 0157H7, to manage the kidney risk without antibiotics, which can sometimes worsen the toxin release. The third criterion is the duration and fever. A fever above 102 degrees Fahrenheit, 39 degrees Celsius, suggests that the infection has gone systemic. The bacteria or their toxins have potentially breached the gut barrier and entered the general circulation, bacteremia or sepsis. Furthermore, the 3-day rule is a standard clinical benchmark. Viral gastroenteritis typically burns itself out within 48 to 72 hours.
If diarrhea persists beyond this window, the differential diagnosis shifts toward more complex causes, parasitic infections like Giardia or Cryptosporidium, which can last for weeks, Clostridioides difficile, C. diff, which requires specific antibiotics like vancomycin, or non-infectious causes such as the onset of inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, or ulcerative colitis. Chronic diarrhea is a metabolic disaster that leads to malnutrition and wasting, requiring a gastroenterologist's investigative expertise. When a patient presents at the emergency department or clinic with these warning signs, the medical machinery springs into action with a sophistication that far outstrips home care. The modern diagnostic workup has been revolutionized by the advent of molecular diagnostics. Historically, doctors relied on stool culture and sensitivity, a process that involved growing bacteria in petri dishes, which could take 48 to 96 hours to yield a result, often too slow to influence immediate treatment. Today, hospitals utilize multiplex PCR panels, such as the BioFire film array. These systems can test a single stool sample for the genetic material of over 20 different pathogens, viruses, bacteria, and parasites simultaneously, delivering a definitive diagnosis in under an hour.
This precision medicine allows doctors to know exactly what they are fighting. Is it norovirus? Supportive care. Is it Giardia? Antiparasitics. Is it Salmonella? Antibiotics only if severe. This targeted approach prevents the blind overuse of antibiotics, which fuels resistance. The medical intervention also involves managing the electrolyte derangements that can stop a heart. Severe diarrhea depletes potassium, hypokalemia, and bicarbonate, metabolic acidosis. A patient may walk into the ER with a normal heart rate, but be on the verge of a fatal arrhythmia due to electrolyte imbalance. The hospital setting allows for the continuous monitoring of cardiac rhythm via telemetry and the precise replacement of electrolytes through IV infusion, correcting the blood chemistry in real time based on lab results. There is also a demographic imperative to seek care. The threshold for warning signs is drastically lower for vulnerable populations, the very young, the very old, and the immunocompromised. In a newborn, even a few hours of diarrhea can be fatal due to their small total body water volume. In the elderly, the stress of dehydration can trigger secondary events, like heart attacks or strokes due to the thickening of the blood. For patients on chemotherapy or immunosuppressants, a simple stomach bug can evolve into overwhelming sepsis within hours. For these groups, the wait-and-see approach is a gamble with lethal odds. The decision to see a doctor is also an ethical and financial calculation in many healthcare systems, but the cost of delay often outweighs the cost of care. The Blue Death of cholera taught humanity that dehydration kills with terrifying speed. While modern sanitation has removed cholera from many parts of the world, the physiological mechanism of death remains the same for any severe diarrhea. The physician stands as the gatekeeper against this outcome. Looking toward the future of medical intervention, we are approaching the era of the smart toilet and home diagnostics. Technology companies are developing toilets equipped with sensors that can analyze stool consistency, detect blood, and even perform basic chemical analysis for infection markers, alerting the user to seek help before they even feel severe symptoms. Furthermore, the technology behind COVID-19 rapid tests is being adapted for gastrointestinal pathogens. Soon, a patient may be able to perform a lateral flow test at home to determine if they have rotavirus or E. coli, allowing for telemedicine consultations where a doctor can prescribe the appropriate medication remotely. This decentralization of diagnostics will bridge the gap between home care and hospital care. In conclusion, the top 10 ways to treat diarrhea form a continuum of care. It begins with the simple chemistry of salt and sugar, ORS, moves through dietary adjustments and rest, enforces the discipline of hygiene, and culminates in the high-tech interventions of modern medicine. Entry number 10 is the safety net. It is the recognition that while the body is a fortress, every fortress can be breached. Knowing when to call for reinforcements, when to surrender the ego of self-reliance, and place one's life in the hands of professionals is the ultimate act of survival. It ensures that a temporary illness does not become a permanent tragedy, preserving the intricate biological miracle of the human system to fight another day.